Hello everyone. In this video we're going to take a deeper look at the render settings and how they affect the quality and the render time. And what I've done, I have this scene here with a tank, a ground, and there is some water here with reflection, refraction, and I do have an environment light and a distant light. And what I've done is I have animated the render settings for various options, and I started off with the camera and then increased that from 2 to 12 and then moved on to the diffuse setting. And at the beginning I didn't have any GI, so any diffuse bounces, so this was okay to be 0. And then once I turned on the diffuse to 1, I started introducing the diffuse samples. So here I'm animating the diffuse, and then once I'm done with that, I'm gonna move on to the glossy to add reflection. So we get water reflecting the tank, and here I'm animating the glossy to go the glossy depth to go from 0 to 1. And at the same time I'm animating the glossy samples. So here I'm animating them from 1 to 10, and then at the end I set everything back to 6, and I start increasing both the depth and the glossy depth, the diffuse and glossy depth from 1 to 5. And I've rendered a sequence, and this is the way you render a sequence. The default path was IP, which means send the render to interactive, and I've gave it this path, which means write the files to this location relative to where my HIP file is, and this is the full path. And the $F4 will give me padding, 4 zeros padding. And then what I've done is I've changed this from render current frame to render a sequence. So I set the sequence from 1 to 40. And then Arnold has AUV, so I turned on a couple of AUVs to be able to debug this. And the main AUVs that we're going to be looking at is the direct illumination of lighting without any indirect diffuse or reflection or anything, just the raw direct diffuse, and that's mainly coming from the camera samples, camera AA. And I also turned on the indirect diffuse, so we can see only the indirect illumination by itself, and also the direct specular, so the reflection of all the lights directly, and the indirect specular, so the reflection of anything that is not a light. And I'm going to, and I've rendered the sequence, and I have stamped over the render time over these images, and we're going to take a look at them and explain the settings. So this is the render. And as you can see, at this point we have the tank, the ground, and the water. And here I have all the settings. They're not, we don't know all of them at this point, but it's I'm going to be explaining the one I'm changing at a time. And basically we have the settings that are being passed to Arnold, and the number of total rays being generated, and this bucket workers done in this is the number of seconds it took to render this image. So at 1920 by 900, this took 27 seconds. And I don't have any diffuse. You can see it's disabled by samples. I don't have any indirect reflection. I don't have any reflection. The water here is not reflecting the tank. And there is no indirect illumination, there is no GI happening in this scene. And I only have 2 samples on the camera, okay? And as I scrub through, we're going to see the number of samples increase. And if you look at this area here and this area, and also the noise overall, we're going to start seeing an improvement, and you can see it here as well. In this area, you can see that we're going to start seeing less and less noise in the image. And I'm actually going to zoom in, and maybe this area makes more sense. So here we're going to see this is the default, and let's see if I can get the render time. Okay, I think this is good as well. So this is the render time, and we're going to start increasing the samples from 2 to 12, I think. And you can see by changing that from 2 to 3, we're getting a lot less noise here. And as I increase that sample, you can see it's pretty much noise free at this point by frame 6, which means 7 samples. So 7 to 6 samples produces pretty much a noise-free render, and it only took 3 minutes. But you can see that you can see the relation between the number of samples and the render time. We started off with 2 samples. You can see how noisy it is in this area, and the render time was 27 seconds. And as we started adding more and more samples, the render time went up, but the quality is much higher. And here you can see the total count of camera rays shot and the shadow rays as well. And I do have refraction in my scene, so that's included. But you can see we're only shooting these type of rays: the camera, the shadows, and the refraction. There is no glossy or diffuse, and it's off right now. And the next option, once I go up to, I think, 12 samples, the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to turn on GI. I'm going to turn on global illumination. You can see the samples have changed to 1, and the depth is set to 1. So we have 1 bounce of global illumination, and you can see the difference already. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to take a look at the indirect diffuse only by itself, without the environment, without everything else. So just the diffuse, the indirect diffuse. And this is what the AUV looks like. So this is the indirect diffuse AUV. And you can see at frame 11, it is off. And we can look at the sample here, the settings here. And as I go to the next frame, we have 1 depth now. And I'm setting back everything to 6. So the samples is set to 6. The AA is set to 6. And you can see with 1 bounce here we are at 2 minutes, and we're only shooting 1 sample. And if you look at the diffuse here, the ray count, we're shooting this much now. So the render time is obviously going to go higher. And as I start to increase the render, the number of samples for the diffuse, you can see we're getting better and better result. And by let's see, by 5 samples, once we reach 5 samples, the result is pretty much noise free. And you can see it's very clean here. It's very clean around this area. It's very clean here. And we're only at 3 minutes right now. And this is how the render looks like. So this is the render with global illumination and using 6 samples. And we're at 3 minutes 24. And there is no reflection of the water. The water is not reflecting the tank, and the tank is not reflecting the geometry here. It's only reflecting the lights. Okay, so the next thing I'm going to do is I think I'm going to keep going up to the diffuse samples, but we can see that we've identified that having 6 or 5 samples in the diffuse is enough to produce a noise-free image. So we don't have to go that high. And then the next thing I'm going to do from frame 20 to 23, I'm going to turn on indirect reflection. So we're going to turn on reflection, and we're going to have the water reflect the tank. And you can see the change in the visual here. And I'm going to take a look at the AUV of the indirect diffuse by itself. So this is the result. At frame 22, we don't have any indirect reflection. So in this frame, we have the glossy, the reflection is turned on, the indirect specular. So and we start off at 1 sample, and you can see here we have it's still pretty noisy. So the tank is reflecting itself at this point, and then the water is reflecting everything else. And also the tank is reflecting the water and the ground. So as I scrub through, let's see if we can get everything, fit everything. So as I scrub through, I'm going to increase the samples, and we can take a look. We can keep keep an eye on the render time. So we went up from let's see, 3 minutes 24 to 3 minutes 44 once we turned on the indirect reflection, the reflection of the geometry. And I'm starting to add samples, and you can see the result is much cleaner once we reach 5 samples as well. So we can use that as a reference for the settings that we want to use for final rendering. And the render time is still very reasonable. I think 6 minutes on this, and we have all this details. So the next thing, I'm going to keep going to, I think, 12 or 10. And you can see the quality is not changing that much after 5 or 6 samples, because the result is pretty much noise free. So you can see that we're changing from 10 to 6 here, and the result is not that high. So the final settings I'm going to be using are 6 for the samples, AA samples, and 6 for the diffuse and 6 for the glossy. I still think I can reduce these downs. I mean, I think the result is for the reflection is still clean at probably 4 samples, maybe 5, and so we can definitely use those instead. And then the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to start increasing the number of depth for the glossy and diffuse. So we're going to be reflecting multiple times the water and the tank, and same for the diffuse. And we're going to take a look at the visual difference here. You can see there is more information. We're seeing more information on the tank. It's subtle. It probably makes more difference in a more complex environment where we have a lot of reflective material facing each other. But you can see we're getting more visual added to the image. And I'm going to take a look at the diffuse, the indirect. So this is the indirect, and we're at 1 sample, and then 2 samples. You can see we're getting more indirect illumination, and 3 samples, 4 samples, and 5 samples. And you can see how the render time is being affected. The more bounces we have, from 6:45 to 2 minutes, it went up by 15 or 17 seconds, and it's going to keep going higher as we add more samples. And I think that's pretty much it for the render settings. We can take a look at the final result here. There is one more thing that I would like to explain, which is the direct diffuse. So we have all the lights hitting the diffuse, okay, hitting the surfaces, and that is called direct diffuse. And this is the AUV for the direct diffuse. And the quality of this AUV is mainly driven by the number of samples in the camera and on the lights. Okay, if we can compensate for this noise by adding more samples to the lights themselves. But I personally recommend solving all the noise using the AA. So this pass here is not affected by any indirect diffuse or any reflection, and it's only the direct illumination of the lights directly. So any Arnold lights, like a distant light, spotlight, or a sky dome. And you can see it's pretty much clean after at 5 or I think even less. Yeah, 4 samples we have pretty much a clean result, maybe 5 samples. And then the other thing that we have is the direct specular. So any reflection that is not a geometry, that is a light, and that's basically a specular. And in this case, a specular can be the reflection of any Arnold light, like a spot, distance, or a point light, or mesh light, or anything, and also a sky dome. And in this case, the sky dome has an HDR, and we're reflecting all of that. And if we zoom in, we'll see that we have a lot of noise as well. And as we increase the AA samples, that this solves pretty much all the noise issues. So hopefully it's clear the difference between the direct reflection, the direct specular and direct diffuse, and indirect specular and indirect diffuse. And this is the final result. And for this scene, I would use probably 6 for the AA and 4 and 4 for the glossy and diffuse at 1 bounce. And that should keep the render time very reasonable for this scene. That's pretty much it for this video. Thanks guys for watching, and see you on the next one. Bye bye.